This generation's technology has allowed aspiring artists and producers, like myself, to produce full musical compositions individually, both on an instrumental and vocal level. For example, nowadays it's possible to create a choir with just one vocalist, either by using effects from DAWs or by layering multiple takes together. Although it is always preferred for more traditional genres to work with a band or a group of people to create that type of music, for other genres like hip-hop and pop, working individually to create a song from scratch can be just as effective. What's even more fascinating is that professional recording studios that are expensive and you need to travel to are really not as valuable or necessary nowadays. It is possible to produce, record, mix and master your music in your own home and get the final product sounding professional, or at least not on like an amateur level. However, there are some steps that you need to take to achieve a semi-professional sound from a home studio, and if you're starting from scratch with no knowledge of producing, recording and mixing, trust me, it's going to be a long journey. I personally started my musical journey before my teens, playing drums, but as I got older, this passion started to fade, and in my teens I started to shift from playing acoustic drums to making beats and rhythms on DAWs. I liked how I could use my drumming knowledge to create drum patterns that I otherwise would have not been able to play, and the fact that there's an infinite amount of sounds that you can choose, create and manipulate, it just really intrigued me. So by the age of 13 to 16, I spent my free time creating beats. This was a learning period. I listened to music and tried to recreate the sounds and rhythms that I heard. But in doing this, I was having fun, so it didn't really feel like I was learning, nor did I realize that. But I later discovered the fact that I could also record my vocals to my own beats. So by age 16 onwards, I started doing so. First by recording just on my MacBook Air's microphone, but over the years, I started to upgrade my equipment, buying microphones, studio monitors, etc. And in the process of doing so, I learned some basic recording and mixing skills. And looking back, you can really see the improvement in my music over the years. Now, I was 20 years old last year, and I had reached a point where I felt my equipment was up to standards. I had a Rode NT1A condenser microphone, 2 KOK Rocket 8 monitors, a cheap audio interface and a good enough PC to run FL Studio. My mixing skills were pretty good for the type of music I was making, but still, when listening to the final product, I realized that something was still missing. Quality-wise, my music still didn't sound on the same level as music made by other established artists. This was because the room I recorded in was completely untreated. If you're watching this video, you probably have the same issue. The room you record in affects the sound of the recording. To put it simply, the sound from your voice doesn't just completely get sucked in by your microphone. The sound waves you create by singing, or playing an instrument, or making any type of noise will bounce around the room and the surfaces of the room, and then eventually some of these waves will travel back and be picked up by the microphone, affecting the sound of the recording, in most cases negatively. So pretty much when recording in an untreated room, you're also recording the reverberation of that room. What we want is for the room to affect the initial signal, so the sound that's being recorded, the least amount possible, so that we can then manipulate the dry recording through mixing exactly how we want without any room sound issues, which could be mitigated in the mixing stage, I guess, but never completely fixed. The problem with room treatment, however, is of course your budget, your room size and shape, and personally for me, the time you have at your disposal to complete the treatment. The cost of achieving the best possible frequency response out of a room, especially a small rectangular room like mine, will be in the thousands, and of course at that point it might just be cheaper to just hire out a recording studio. The reason small rectangular square rooms are more problematic is that they have parallel walls that are very close to each other, causing sound waves to bounce around these surfaces very easily at a higher amplitude level. I will later explain the problems this creates. For an individual university project, I wanted to see if, with a budget of say $500 to $600, I could significantly improve the sound of my home studio by applying acoustic treatment to it. The purpose of my room treatment is mainly for vocal recording and mixing, but I could also aim for it to be suitable for recording certain instruments that aren't too loud, such as acoustic guitars and other instruments around that amplitude level. For instruments like drums, I don't think it's possible, at least within my budget, to treat such a small room to achieve a dry enough signal. The goal is to achieve a more consistent frequency response of the room. So in this video, I will show you the whole acoustic treatment process that I did, and I'll explain why I chose to apply it the way I did. I will compare the data I collected from the initial untreated room with the final room to see if my project was successful, and I will point out any mistakes that I made in the process, so that if you choose to take a similar route in your room treatment process, you can learn from my mistakes and do an even better job. Hopefully in doing this, I can guide any aspiring artists or producers such as myself to create an affordable, good recording and mixing environment at home. Before I start explaining the process, however, I just want to point out that completely covering every surface of your room with absorbers is not a good idea. It won't ensure a flat frequency response, and it'll just completely drain the life out of your recordings. I started the project by researching scholarly articles relevant to the acoustic treatment of small rooms. I learned how sound behaves in such rooms. There's a lot of definitions and concepts to this, and I'll mention these words frequently throughout this video. So to not confuse you, I will leave the definitions of these words on screen and in the description of this video. By reading these articles, I learned that my room type tends to create a lot of phasing issues, especially in the lower frequencies. This is because of how close together the walls are and other surfaces. There is a higher chance of two similar waves meeting each other, and this either boosts that particular frequency or cancels it out. As bass frequencies have longer waves, they take longer to decay. For example, 50 Hz has a wavelength of about 6 meters. In a room with two parallel surfaces that are about 3 meters apart, a standing wave can really easily be created, causing serious phasing issues for that frequency. There is also the issue of reverberation. As there are so many close surfaces to the sound source, sound waves return to the microphone quicker than in a larger room, resulting in a louder reverberation effect right after the original sound source. I then started to research how these issues can be reduced with the use of acoustic materials. Once again, I'll explain what each of these materials do more in depth in the description of this video, but here's a very useful guide I found explaining each material type, why they are needed, and how they work and can be applied. To better understand what the acoustic issues were specifically with my room, I conducted some room measurements using a free software called Room EQ Wizard. This software can be used to measure and analyze the frequency response of the room, so how the room reacts when a sound is produced in it. By looking at the data, I was able to have a good idea of the sonic issues specifically to my room. Reading the manual of the software was really helpful for me in understanding how to use the software. This is a video that really helped me when I first began doing room measurements. It explains how to set up the software step by step and run a measurement sweep. To conduct these measurements, you will need a measurement microphone, but don't worry, you can find good quality ones for as little as $65, such as the Behringer ECM 8000 reference condenser microphone. A measurement microphone is designed to have an accurate, flat frequency response, so that when conducting room measurements, the microphone will not significantly skew the data. You'll also need an audio interface, which I'm assuming you already have, but if not, there are cheap and decent quality ones out there as well. Also, you need some loudspeakers or studio monitors. Once you're done with the measurement, you now need to analyze the data to see what specific issues you have to tackle. Here's a video that I found really useful in helping me decode the data. I first looked at the overall impulse response of the room. The overall impulse response gathered from the room scan proved that there was a lot of uncontrolled reverberation. In fact, it took around 600 milliseconds for the initial signal to come to a complete halt, proving the fact that there were a lot of waves bouncing around the room and returning to the microphone, negatively affecting the recording. The bigger issue is the fact that the first, say, 50 milliseconds of the reverb is really high in amplitude, but this graph only shows the overall decay time. The truth is that different frequencies will have different decay times, some more problematic than others. So to further analyze this reverberation issue, I looked at the spectrogram view on Room EQ Wizard. The spectrogram view not only shows the decay time specific to each frequency, but also how the amplitude or loudness of each frequency is boosted or reduced. These boosts and cuts in amplitude are caused by room modes, creating phasing issues, while the long decay times are caused by resonances in the room, once again caused by room modes. The goal is consistency. At the end of the treatment, I want to see less peaks in decay and overall just a more consistent decay time, which is seen in the length of these waves throughout the frequency spectrum. The same applies to the amplitude of each frequency. I want the amplitude of the frequencies to be more consistent. So when assessing the decay of the bass frequencies, I could see that these low-end frequencies generally have the longest decay times out of all of the frequency spectrum. The longest being 60 Hz, taking 300 milliseconds to decay to around 100 dB SPL, but also 48 Hz and 147 Hz. As you can see from the colors, these bass frequencies are the most boosted in amplitude, but also the most quiet in other areas. This showed me that the low end of my room is really inconsistent in amplitude, and this range has the longest decay times out of the whole frequency spectrum. So seeing these issues in the low end informed me that there are room modes causing resonances and phasing issues in the low end. This is what made me decide to apply bass traps to my room. When looking at the frequency response of the low mids, we yet see more frequencies, such as 270 Hz and 300 Hz, being amplified way too much. We can observe a trend of slight decrease in amplitude as the frequencies get higher on the spectrum, but there's still this problematic comb filtering effect, so uneven decay times, just not to the same degree as the low end. We can see the long decay times in the low mids, these frequencies all taking about 200 milliseconds to decay to 100 dB SPL. These are the second longest decay times in the frequency spectrum, the longest being in the low end. The main difference between the low mids and the bass frequencies can be seen in a slightly shorter and more consistent decay times. The decay times of the mid frequencies are significantly shorter and more consistent than the frequencies under, the longest being 832 Hz, taking about 120 milliseconds to reach below 100 dB SPL. The mids are also much more consistent in amplitude, but they still need to be improved. So the data from the low mids and mids has informed me that I will need to implement some absorbers to control the overall reverberation of these frequencies, as well as to reduce the peaks in amplitude. Between 2000 and 20,000 Hz, we see the lowest trend in decay times out of the frequency categories, also the most consistent amplitude response. Having said so, the decay time of the high end still could be flatter. I believe the use of absorbers will also help control the reverberation in the high end frequencies. But figuring out which frequencies are problematic and what materials will help these issues is not enough. We have to identify the root problem to these phasing and resonance problems. We know that room modes are what's causing these phasing and resonance issues. So when applying the acoustic treatment, we need to identify where these resonances and modes are happening. This will help us in knowing where to place the materials and how much material we should apply. There's a very useful website called AM Acoustics that has a room mode calculator. You put in the dimensions of your room and it displays which frequencies are affected by room modes and what areas of the room modes are the loudest. The first thing I looked at was the equivalent absorption area needed, which was 6.83 meters squared of my room's total surface area. This gave me a rough idea of how many absorption panels or materials I should cover the room with. Then I looked at the areas that are most affected by the room modes. As you can see, most of the modes are affecting frequencies between 47 and 370 Hz. With small rooms like mine, these frequencies are going to be the most affected. But according to the 3D room view, it seemed like the room modes were affecting pretty much every surface of my room. This proved to me that a room like mine pretty much creates every type of room mode imaginable. So at first, the fact that the recommended amount of absorption area was 6.8 meters squared kind of confused me, because my room has a surface area of 52 meters squared, and with room mode issues occurring everywhere, how is 6.8 meters squared of absorption enough? Well, there's a few answers to this question. One is that it's simply not possible to have a perfect frequency response, especially in a room like mine. We have to be realistic here. Also, covering every surface with, say for example, bass trapping materials is going to affect the whole frequency spectrum differently, resulting in a highly uneven frequency response and just an overly dead sounding room. So this is the realistic conclusion I came up with. Within the bass frequencies, the ones that affect my recordings the most, in other words, more noticeable in the recordings, will be up in the 200 to 300 Hz range. Frequencies lower than that, I almost always EQ them out. So within the 200 to 350 range, I observed that the room modes were the loudest in the corners of the room. So I therefore decided to cover each corner of my room with bass traps. Now remember, the 3D view only shows where the modes are the loudest in the room, but not how the waves bounce around to create these loud areas. This is where the absorbers come into play. If I place them on parallel surfaces, they should not only tackle the decay and amplitude issues I previously saw in the middle and higher frequencies, but they should also somewhat reduce the amount of low frequencies reaching those loud amplitude points. So it's really a game of controlling the loud areas where the bass frequencies are resonating and trying to reduce the sound waves from getting there in the first place, while also not completely covering the room with absorbers. Before I talk about how I applied the materials, I have to say that where you place your microphone and studio monitors is important. For the best results, you'd like to place your microphone so that the walls the artist is facing when recording are as far away from the microphone as possible. What I would do is place the microphone between the middle of the room and one of the corners. Scrunching yourself up in a corner will mean that a lot of the waves you're creating will interact with the walls on your right and left, and even if you're not directly facing them, it's still going to affect the sound. With your monitors, make sure the surface they are facing is as far away as possible. So in a rectangular room like mine, you want to put them along the short side of the room. Unfortunately, I couldn't do this as I have a door and a window on those short sides. Also make sure that the surface your speakers are facing is treated with absorbers to reduce the amount of waves coming from your speakers and bouncing straight back to the listener. So let's get into what materials I bought, where I got them from, and how I applied them. I didn't want to damage the walls, so I bought these things from my local hardware store. They have some sort of glue on both sides and you just peel off the label and stick them on. I cut them into squares and used 4 for every panel or bass trap. I bought 24 foam bass traps from Amazon of dimensions 12 by 12 by 24 centimeters, each only costing me $56. Bass traps are materials that work to absorb low-end frequencies. If placed in the right areas, they should stop low-frequency waves from resonating, therefore reducing their amplitude. Buying cheap pre-made bass traps was kind of a mistake. I say kind of because professional bass traps are extremely expensive, but they are really efficient. The ones I bought are made from the same materials as normal absorbers, which mainly absorb mid to high frequencies. The only difference with these bass traps is that they are triangular and can fit in the corners of your room, where the low end typically ends up resonating. If you want a better result while still on a budget, here's a video that will help you build better bass traps. Having said so, it really does depend on the type of music and recording you want to make. For example, if you are treating your room for the purpose of vocal recording, the frequency response of the low end might not be so much of an issue for you, as these frequencies are commonly cut out or reduced by equalizing in the mixing stage. So these bass traps that I bought might just do the job for you. Towards the end of the video, I will show you how my treatment affected the recordings. So it's really up to you whether you decide to go with the cheap pre-made bass trapping option. Anyways, I tried to apply these bass traps equally in each corner of the room to control the bass resonances that occur in those areas. I then also purchased 120 absorption panels for $208 from a website called My Deal, each measuring 5 cm in thickness and 30 cm in length and width. Acoustic panels materials are typically made of foam. They are efficient in absorbing mid to high frequencies, but also somewhat tackle the low end too. Acoustic panels are really efficient in decreasing overall reverb decay times, and if placed correctly, they can reduce problematic room modes. The thickness of these panels is very important. The thicker they are, the more they absorb, but this affects the price as well. I do recommend to go for the thicker panels, like 5 cm. These panels I bought covered 10.8 meters squared out of the total surface area of 52 meters squared of my room. I must note that there is an even cheaper option to buying these pre-made materials. The issue with using these materials, however, is that they are not that visually pleasing, unless you get creative with it, which can be costly. Anyways, if looks aren't too much of a worry for you, I have linked a video explaining how to build these absorbers yourself. Another way to increase frequency absorption is to use rugs. My room has wooden floors, so it's highly reflective, so in placing 2 rugs covering most of the floor area, as well as having a mattress in my room, was useful in reducing waves bouncing between the floor and the ceiling. To tackle the issue of standing waves causing phasing issues, I placed these panels parallel to each other. So if one wall had a bunch of panels in an area, I tried to put the same amount of panels in the same area of the opposite wall. These absorbers should not also reduce phasing issues, which cause boosts and cuts in amplitude, but they should significantly reduce the reverb and decay time of the room, quite simply because they're absorbing these waves and stopping them from bouncing around the room. As I previously mentioned, I recommend to place your microphone towards the corner of the room, with the back of the microphone facing the furthest corner. Because of this, I applied a lot of acoustic panels in front of the microphone, also on the ceiling of that corner, just to make sure those close by surfaces don't cause any early reflections, as this can happen even if most of the sound is traveling in the opposite direction. After applying these materials, I reconducted some room measurements to observe which issues are still problematic and preventing a more constant frequency response. I noticed that from around 1000 Hz onwards, the comb filtering effect was significantly reduced, and the amplitude of these frequencies was very constant. However, when looking at the 40 to 200 frequency range, there was still a lot of phasing issues, boosts in amplitudes, frequencies cancelled out or reduced too much, and long decay times. This revealed that the cheap bass traps I bought were not efficient enough in tackling the previously observed phasing issues in the low end of the frequency spectrum. When looking at the mid frequencies, I definitely observed some improvements in the consistency of decay times and frequency amplitude, but still not to the same standard as the higher frequencies. I also still noticed a few problematic phase cancellation issues in this category, which worried me because I thought applying panels around the room would significantly control these standing waves. The ideal solution to the bass issues would have been to purchase more expensive bass traps, but my budget could not allow this. The cheaper option was to buy materials that can act as bass traps, such as rock wool, but I predicted that building the bass traps myself would employ a lot of time, and as this was a university project, I did not have the time to do so. To tackle the still persistent issue of comb filtering in the mid frequencies, I determined that the cheapest and most time-efficient solution was to build a sound diffuser. Diffusers scattered sound waves around, instead of absorbing them. They are useful in tackling phasing issues or to liven up the sound of a room. Now, building a diffuser wasn't a bad idea, but what I didn't consider at the time was that you can control which frequency range will be scattered the most. My understanding was that diffusers only mainly helped with the mid-range frequencies, but I then learned that the length and width of each column affects which frequencies come in contact with the diffuser and therefore are scattered. The wider the columns are, the lower are the frequencies that are scattered, and vice versa. The same goes with the length of the columns. Anyways, for the issues in the mid frequencies, the diffuser I built was somewhat useful. It was a good idea, but I could have done a much better job with minimal effort. I had columns ranging from lengths of 0 to 30 centimeters or 6.5 centimeters wide. Using a website called Hi-Fi Audio Design, I can see that these dimensions scatter frequencies between 570 and 2600 Hz. To learn from my mistakes, if you decide that a diffuser is needed in your room, use this calculator and figure out the dimensions needed to tackle your problematic frequency range. The website will tell you exactly how to build your diffuser for your desired needs. To make a base for my diffuser, I recycled some wood from an old bed. I used super glue to stick these pieces together, and then I also glued and nailed support planks on the back. It seems pretty sketchy, but it was actually quite structurally sound. I bought some timber planks from Facebook Marketplace for $60, and I cut pieces out of them of different dimensions, ranging from 1 to 30 centimeters. I then superglued these timber pieces onto the base, trying to randomize the dimensions so that no pieces of similar size were next to each other. I then positioned the diffuser on a wall with no absorbers on both sides, so that the standing waves caused by the untreated parallel surfaces will now be somewhat scattered by my diffuser. So with the finished room, let's look at the results. When looking at the frequency spectrum of the finished room, we can observe a significant decrease in phasing issues, from 350 until 20,000 Hz. The decay times are shorter and much more consistent, and the amplitude of these frequencies is also much more consistent. This is what I wanted to see, and I'm happy to have achieved these results within my budget. However, from 40 to 300 Hz, we can still see a lot of long decay times. What surprised me is that a lot of the previous frequencies with long decay times have been decreased. These frequencies all have been decreased by 100 milliseconds or more. But when focusing on frequencies between 100 to 200 Hz, most decay times remain similar, and a lot of decay times in this category are even boosted. Having said so, the peaks and decay times in the base frequencies are still not as problematic as they were before treatment. In the 40 to 300 Hz range, we do see a decrease in phase cancellation, with the only significant frequencies still having this issue being 50 Hz and 100 Hz. Amplitude-wise, there is more consistency in this frequency range, but not to the same standard as the rest of the frequency spectrum. When looking at the overall impulse response, there is a significant change. The room sound decays much faster and with a steeper curve, meaning that the overall amplitude of the impulse response is lower as well. For example, before the treatment, it took 90 milliseconds for the sound to decay to 1% of the impulse. It now takes less than 30 milliseconds. So, to conclude this video, I would say that I definitely have achieved a better sounding room with a low budget. My total spending was just over 500 Australian dollars, equaling around 320 US dollars. The room now is much less reverberant and more consistent in its frequency response. However, I could have done a much better job. The cheap bass traps I used were not good enough. Foam just isn't that good in absorbing low-end frequencies, and the diffuser that I built could have been much more efficient. But hey, for the purpose of this video, the fact that I can recognize these mistakes can help you achieve an even better result. The recordings I can now make, especially for vocals, are at a very good standard, and when listening and comparing recordings I made before and after the treatment, at least for me, there is a very noticeable difference. Here are two almost identical recordings I made before and after the treatment, and let me know if you can notice a difference.
I know I should've never tried. Now they wonder why I hate you. You're the one that made me cry. Now they wonder why I hate you. I believed all your lies. Never thought that I'd replace you. It was all a waste of time. Had to learn that I can't change you. When I tell you that I'm done with these games, you play me the same. The same way you left is the same way you came. Now I'm left with no options other than just pain.
I hope this video can help guide you in your acoustic treatment process, and that you can learn from my mistakes to create a professional sounding home studio. Thanks so much for watching, and good luck with your home studio treatment.